because what I'm going to describe here, I didn't do for 20 years in my work. I want to just sort of acknowledge that in some ways this represents something of a very very slow process of learning for me. And the confession is that I spent, I think, 20 years in a traditional way in a child mental health team, taking referrals of children, young people and families, and applying my skills as best as I could to being helpful to children and families. And I was probably as modestly successful as many of us are. The confession is that in that process, I never really had any curiosity, not really, about all the other people who might be helpful to that child in their life. I saw myself as the helper at the center of a helping system. I assumed I was at the center. And really, in some ways, some of the, and it's a little bit to my shame, some of the others who might be involved in a child's life, a social worker or a teacher, they were helpful if they shared my ideas, or they were. But much of the time, I might have seen them as a bit of a problem because they didn't want to do it my way. The whole point of this talk now is that I would start in a completely different way. I would start in a community. I'm profoundly interested as much in the helping system as I am in the problem. That I would all start with questions always about who's helpful to you now. When you get, if I'm talking to a child who's anxious, or when you get anxious, who's helpful to you now? What do they do? Can I do a bit of what they do? So I'd be trying to find out in the wider system about the processes of help, rather than assuming that I am at the center of this. So the whole of this talk is just how do we help people to become curious about the contributions that others will make to the lives of the children and young people and parents who we're trying to help. This is in the wheel. We always start this is about working with networks. So being how do we create ways of being curious about what's going on outside of our particular area of work? And I suppose one of the things that has been astonishing for us in this journey in AMBIT is that what we discover is the sort of disintegration processes that we thought was just us, or it was just the UK, or it was just a kind of bit of a it's just a sort of an aspect of a sort of local problem of that we didn't really work very well together. It turns out that wherever we go, all over the place, you get the same. You get people go, yeah, that's what it's like here. It's a sort of the nature of how I think the collaboration of specialist services around the needs of a child are profoundly tricky. And this is just an example of a recent training we did in a country in Bulgaria, actually, in which we have very different systems, very different kind of sort of helping systems. But in fact, exactly the same thing, where the first case they talked about was a young person who'd moved from a residential care to a secure unit to a hospital, and all the time, each part of this jigsaw, that each system saw themselves as central to the help of that child. So, but for the young person, they obviously experienced it very, very differently, a sort of chaos of different organizations trying to be helpful to them. And I suppose one of the things that contributes these things into some of the difficulties that we have in recognizing the value of others is that it may be that part of all teams are rather exposed to somewhat the potential for negative feedback loops about the experience of our clients with other services. There is a kind of understandable way in which, to some degree, referrals to one service represent something of a failure of another, possibly. Anyway, there's a kind of element of that. But I think also part of where for some families, certainly for us, they engage us partly by emphasizing the values we bring, that they see us as being helpful sometimes, and how unhelpful others have been in the past. It creates a bit of a kind of potential for us to develop kind of somewhat stereotypes about other services through the kind of feedback we may receive from some clients. So I guess always, as I was saying, the question now is, for me, is who understands you best, and who do you find it easiest to trust, etc. These are the kind of, it seems to me, really fun, not about the problem, about the nature of help, to be equally interested in both. Now, I'm just going to now talk about incredibly, I'm almost sort of embarrassed to call it a technique, not really, but the intention here is to try to enable a worker with the client, with the child, with the family, it just couldn't be more simple way of trying to see the wider picture. So we just call it a program, and essentially you're just drawing a picture of who's involved in this young person. So you can sit down. All you need, nothing complicated. Piece of paper will do fine. A pen, that's all you need. And you put the young person, the client, in the middle, and you just draw it out. I'm imagining here, this is a 15-year-old young person, and we just start to say, okay, so how does it all work? Where are all the pieces? Who both in the professional system and the non-professional system, who's important in your life? Who's actually, who's well, and what I would now, in the sort of language I say, who's part of the backup team? A concept I took from interpersonal psychotherapy. I think it's a really nice idea. Who's part of the backup team? And it may well be that myself, as the AMBIT worker, I might be part of the backup team. I might be part of the team around the worker. So we're trying to think where's the social resources? Where's the support? Now, part of what we do when we map it out, as you'll see, we're just putting, there's no clever technique here, but we're sort of putting people close to each other if they have any kind of working relationship. And what often emerges, just sort of quick conversations, is that in cases that the youth worker in this particular case had never really had much to do with the school Senko. And then, well, certainly in the mind of the family or the young person, they don't see them as having any connections, or don't have a sense that they've got a shared idea about what Jack's problem is, and that they're kind of got a bit of a kind of shared plan, which they might even better have worked out with Jack, and how those things fit together. But you're looking for the point, the sort of point of challenge, or if I can call it challenge, or the point of development, is to create curiosity about the resources in a young person's life. Because the question is, okay, so you turn up as you kind of, whatever we call them, you're the AMBIT worker. Where are you going to fit into that? You're not starting, a phrase we now use rather commonly, you're not starting a helping system, you're joining one. And my first 20 years of practice, I always thought I was starting a helping system. I called it therapy, and I was starting something. Okay, here's that we finally got to a problem. We're going to start a project. No, I don't think that's how it works. To me, the kind of you're thinking, okay, what can I contribute into something that already exists? And I think, in some areas of work, particularly now, if I give an example in relation to effective treatments for child anxiety, the work of Kathy Creswell in the UK has been incredibly influential, showing really you can get equal effects in working entirely through the parent. You don't have to see the child at all. Now, that's equal effects. And as ever, the principle would be some children need to be seen directly, some may not. But the implications for us in AMBIT is incredibly important, because if you have a child who's very, very anxious, they're having learning experiences every day with their carer, with their teacher, with their brother, with their grandfather, with their dance teacher, whoever it is. Those interactions will be part of what may enable them to find ways of managing, or even beginning to ameliorate some of the anxieties that they feel. Excluding them from being explicitly part of the helping system seems to us, yeah, well, certainly we would be wanting to invite curiosity. Now there may be my goodness, we've worked with families where it doesn't always seem very obvious where the resources are. Absolutely right. And sometimes one has to work incredibly hard to find these kind of resources in a young person's life, particularly AMBIT set up with many young people whose circumstances were not easy to see where that is. But I think from over time, we've developed some confidence that you just have to look hard and to have a mindset that places this curiosity at the center of work. Some teams now we've trained, they do this routinely as part of first appointments. And that's, okay. Now, I suppose the second technique I'm going to show you, we call them disintegration grids. Now, this is really, the intention here is to try to see, again, you're trying to visualize, you're trying to see a system. And as an element of decentering oneself, not putting oneself at the center of this, and what it's like to be different people within this network I've just described. So the program just gives you a quick, easy, ready-made sort of impression. It's a bit like a sketch, if we call it this. The first is a bit like a sketch. This is a bit more like a painting, I suppose. A bit more. There's a little trying to give a little bit more kind of meat to what the situation is within the system. So we're trying to map out what we call kind of levels of disintegration. And what this is really trying to draw out what are the sort of fundamental kind of assumptions that may be in place within the helping system about what is going on for a particular child or young person. So what do people think is the problem? What's the problem? And in this, I'll give you an illustration in a moment. What's the problem? What do people think? Is it that because they use too much cannabis? Is it because they can't read? Is it because they have a very bad relationship with their father? What is it that is seen as the kind of primary kind of problem? And very often in networks, one of the difficulties is that everyone's got a different version of what the primary problem is. And that makes the kind of the possibility of collective approach to the difficulties much more challenging. If you don't have an idea about what the kind of what the fundamental kind of problem is, then obviously somewhat inevitably you're going to have rather different ideas about what the intervention is. So we're kind of interested in, okay, so what do people think should happen? Oh, well, this kid should be in hospital. This kid should be in a special school. This kid should be in care. You get these kind of very, very teleological kind of solutions to this. So my colleagues in the child mental health services were always complaining that that some of the children they work with should be in care. The social workers were always complaining that some of the children they were working with should be in hospital. You know, it was a kind of endless kind of a sense that somebody else had the expertise that was being denied their particular kind of client. So again, what the third question is, okay, so if that's what should happen, who is responsible for that happening? Again, there can be, and this may be a particular UK problem, but my goodness, there can be fights at that level as to is this a mental health problem? Is this an educational problem? Is this a social care problem? I mean, thankfully, in some areas, and one of the areas where I worked, we moved on a lot from the usual kind of fights about that to try having a more collaborative approach to that problem. But we're trying to kind of map out. So around a particular child, oh no, hang on, just to say, just to there's some understandable, oh, sorry, I'm losing my thread. So these would be the sort of people that you might want to include in the disintegration grid. So including members of the family and some of the key people. Again, you're getting used to the kind of thread of these kind of conversations. And again, no need to kind of really dwell on this. There's kind of understandable aspects of this, of which we don't shy away from, and we kind of accept that they're likely to be in place. All sorts of aspects of disagreements, fears, and rivalries that may take place, or simply that people just don't know each other at all. A pretty common aspect of this. We had an amazing event once in Barcelona. Dick and I were invited to do a presentation. What was amazing, apart from the fact that the mayor of the particular area of Barcelona came, which was astonishing, but also for the first time, as far as we have heard about it, the usual sort of suspects of social workers and health professionals and pediatricians and all sorts of people, but the police came. This caused immense interest. I mean, it was absolutely fabulous. The police contributed to this day really, really, really well, really thoughtfully. But what was just great was that here, the kind of usual kind of the importance of certain agencies to the client group, which were often sort of somewhat discounted. It's true in the UK, definitely, were brought in to a conversation about the needs of young people who were kind of living on the streets, or all sorts of had enormous sort of social difficulties. So this is what a grid looks like. So simply, again, the intention is to create a kind of method that you haven't got to go and look it up on the web or find out something complicated. You try and do something that you can almost just draw it out yourself, and you can do this with a client, with a parent, or with other workers, or within your team. And following on the theme from yesterday, you can put along the top, if we're trying to say, okay, who are the usual suspects, you could put different members of the team along the top. And as to okay, we want to just map out what are the similarities and differences in terms of what's the problem, what to do, and who can help. Very kind of not overly elaborated kind of concepts. And so, and the intention is to try and get a kind of overview. So the statements are not, they're not, as I was saying, overly complicated. So in this particular example, the grandmother thinks that what's the problem is that my grandson has just got caught up in a whole in some unhealthy relationships in gangs. The youth worker thinks the problem is that there's just use of cannabis. The school think the problem is that the family lack authority and to support regular school attendance. And the young person, I'm just going to have to move because I can't see my own screen, is that, well, for the young person, and if I can emphasize this is not an uncommon, we have all these complicated ideas about what a young person sees their problem is, and they just say, I haven't got any money. Talking about money, it was again a great lesson for me in AMBIT. If you want to ask young people about, what they see, that what's the problem? The problem is a lot often to do with money. Certainly, it's an interesting area to explore. Somewhat in my previous working life, I tended to not focus on that so much. Now, so then what's the intervention? So for the grandmother, the intervention, he should go to a residential school to get him away from those relationships. For the youth worker, you would want to try and engage him with a drugs team and try and alter the friendship group. For the school, they see the problem as really, we're just all messing about, this is never going to change. He needs to be in care. And for the young person, he would stop offending if someone could give him some money. So again, you can sort of see that how do we get something that then hangs these different things together? So who's responsible? So for the grandmother, she's writing letters to the education authority, trying to get them to do something. The youth worker is trying to refer to a drug and alcohol team. The school are kind of frustrated with social care, and the young person thinks that doesn't live with dad, but he thinks dad should give him some money, and and partly there may be all sorts of understandable, maybe less conscious motivations to the young person to try and engage his dad his life. Now, okay, so you say, well, what do we do with that? Well, following Dickens' emphasis that we haven't got time to get everybody in the room together. Well, nowadays, of course, we don't have to get in a room together, but nevertheless, the kind of thinking here is that we've got to use time very efficiently. So we're trying to think, okay, so we've got a system here. There's two aspects, I suppose, that we would hope come out of this this exploration. One is that it might help us to understand the system a little better. So we're trying to drive a little bit of understanding, our own understanding, maybe the understanding of the young person. But let's start by, rather than shouting at each other, let's see if we can develop a kind of understanding of why it is that the system probably is not going to work that effectively at the moment, or you can see the difficulties that are very, very easily going to arise, having mapped out what may be going on for this young person. What we then came up with is just that, okay, and people have got big caseloads. There's no point in coming up with some sort of idealized solution where we get everyone together, we all sort of, it's not going to happen. What we came up with was the kind of idea of what we call connecting conversations. We kind of set ourselves a task. Supposing you had an hour and you had to try and think about how can we make this network work a little bit more effectively around the needs of this young person. What would we use that time for? Because it's very, very easy, and I'm going to keep saying it probably too much, it's very easy to come up with in trainings, over elaborate kind of solutions, which are completely unrealistic to the pressures of teams. Well, the whole point here, if I would say, one of the things we would like to think about in AMBIT, and I think it's true for example, the technique that Dickens talked about thinking together, is we've got to save time. It's absolutely pointless, certainly in our experience with teams, of coming up with clever ideas that increase activity or increase pressure. These techniques are designed to try to increase efficiency or best use of time. Maybe efficiency is a bit of a cold word. Best use of time. So we're trying to get what would be here. We're trying to get what we call connecting conversations. Who needs to talk to who about what? Now, it seemed to us that let's see if we can get a little bit of movement on aspects of money. Is there a conversation that could be had between grandmother and young person about sorting out how does he get any money at all? What is it? And could we help facilitate that so that we could try and see if we could address some aspect of the kind of stresses that are repeatedly happening week after week in this relationship, and whether we could join grandmother and young person in trying to address something that was real to the young person as a starting point. And we also then thought, okay, this is another thing on this one. Let's see if we can get youth worker in the school to think a little bit about it, but it's not so helpful for them to have a completely different idea of where they're wanting to go in relation to the intervention that seems to them to be effective. Can we facilitate a conversation between? Can we join it, or just encourage? Can we create, I suppose, here some curiosity within the system about why people have different ideas about what might be helpful to this young person? So we're talking about, really a bit of maybe a conference call or getting 3 people together on the phone, because it has to be realistic to the pressures of people within these systems. These systems are sustained by people being under pressure to do things without necessarily taking account of, and I include myself, as I said right at the beginning, of not really taking proper attention to the fact that our clients have multiple relationships, which we lose sight of very, very easily. Okay, so
Peter, I'm jumping in. I'm sorry.
Yes.
We have 5 more minutes for your talk.
So just finishing off. Yes, absolutely. That's perfect. Thank you. Now there will be interagency processes that will already be in place in schools. There will be for kids with additional educational needs. There will be planning sort of structures. There will be ways that professionals are brought together. So I don't want to give an impression that I want to ignore that in any way. It seems to me that there are opportunities where some of this networking can happen. I suppose I was very struck by a conversation that we only had last week about preparing for this conference, about a very simple but a kind of profound idea about moving from cooperation to collaboration in some of those discussions. And I think I've been in many meetings, sort of safeguarding meetings or teams around the family, where we can establish a certain amount of cooperation. We all kind of agree what we're all going to do, but the degree to which we're seriously collaborating around a shared understanding of the needs of the child, I think is very limited. In fact, again, one of the kind of defining experiences for me is how rarely that happened. How rarely people were interested in what I thought about a child. They were just interested in whether I was seeing them, which is kind of all right. I mean, at least we kind of knew who they were seeing, but if we didn't ever progress that to, well, what do you make of that? What do you make of it? I mean, again, I'm exaggerating to make the point. Okay, so just to sum up, as you know, complex helping systems behave in unpredictable ways. You're trying to create some predictability and some understanding of what's leading to that unpredictability. And as I mentioned yesterday, it is surprising to the degree to which antagonistic or negative feelings may be around in a system between different agencies, which need some thought and attention as to how we make sense of those things, because fundamentally, because the needs of the young people and children who we're trying to serve will not be served well when that is the case. So AMBIT is trying to create, through those kind of techniques, a kind of curiosity about the wider context of the young person's situation and how we come to a collaborative, shared approach, or at least certainly recognize and understand, like in the idea of the jazz band, that we understand that people will be playing different instruments, and that's okay. We haven't all got to do the same, but we have a shared understanding of how the different parts, the different instruments contribute to the overall tune. Thank you.